Today I'm going to talk about a topic that we've really been talking about for much of the day anyway, but I'm really going to focus in on the political aspect of tribalism, especially in the sense of the political parties that we have, at least in the United States today. Unfortunately, I think this is one of the forms in which tribalism is its most pronounced. And you really especially see this right now in the run-up to the midterm elections on Tuesday. And I promise you, I am not going to tell you how to vote. In fact, I am not even going to tell you to vote. That's a really controversial statement. But what I do want to do is at least try to illustrate for you the extent to which our political system is dominated by various kinds of tribalism. And then I also want to, in the spirit of what Dr. Gate was discussing, try to give you some advice on how to avoid tribalism in your own political thinking, where I think even you can be tempted by it. But before getting into the really heavy and not very motivating topic of today's politics, I do want to take a brief digression to discuss an anecdote to get us started that will take us happily out of the realm of politics and into the realm of sports. How do you decide which team to root for in a football match? Well, I grew up in relatively small town Wisconsin, and I rooted for the Green Bay Packers. Why did I root for the Packers? I wasn't really actually much of a sports fan, and so I know that there are people who will pick a team based on their athleticism. That wasn't my reason. I certainly wasn't rooting for them based on the aesthetics of their uniform, because my goodness, look at those colors. Part of it, I think, was that it was fun, especially if they were in a game against the Bears, to diss those folks from Chicago. We didn't like them in Wisconsin. And frankly, there wasn't much else to root for in Wisconsin. I'll come back to that. Now, this may sound like a relatively superficial, arbitrary, accidental set of reasons for rooting for a sports team. I mean, at the end of the day, it came down to who were the people around me rooting for. And it was fun to root for this team together. And I think that having not very deep reasons for picking a team to root for in sports is not really a problem. Or at least it's a pretty innocuous one if there is any problem with it. Why? Because sports, because football, baseball, it's just a game. At the end of the day, it doesn't make a difference, really, practically speaking, who wins. You're not going to get a check in the mail if your favorite team wins. It's something that we root for fun. But what happens if we start rooting for political teams along the same lines as we root for sports teams? That is, with similarly superficial, arbitrary, accidental kinds of reasons, like the people around me are voting for this party, or the people who look like me or who talk like me are voting for this party. The trouble is that politics isn't a game. It does make a difference at the end of the day for your life and your values, who's running the government, which policies they're adopting, and that makes it really problematic when people start treating politics the same way they treat sports. And unfortunately, we have much too much of that today. And I want to try to give you some indications of just how far this problem has gone. I'm going to start by giving you what I think are 3 signs by which you can recognize tribalism in our political system today. I have 3 signs. And before getting into that, I do want to mention that there's different kinds of things you might call tribalism in politics. One of them is One of them is the kind that I think we've spent more time talking about today, where it's really direct and it's really overt. It's the kind where somebody decides to join a political camp for just overtly ethnic reasons, for instance. So all the women are supposed to be members of the Democratic Party, and all the African Americans are supposed to be members of the white men are supposed to join the Republicans. I don't think that most people here are going to have a problem being tempted by that really overt tribalism. But again, getting to the spirit of what Dr. Gate was recommending, when you're criticizing tribalism, don't do it in a way where you think you're exempt from it entirely yourself. Because I think there is a more subtle kind, a subtler kind of tribalism that a lot of us can be subject to. And it's not when we ourselves are tempted by these kind of overt ethnic kinds of motivations, but where maybe each of these two camps is trying to pull us into its orbit. And they're exerting a lot of emotional pressure on us to do it. And we don't want to be alone. We feel alone in the culture. We find there's somebody that we need to latch on to. And even if we don't agree with the motivation of one of the two camps, we nonetheless end up picking to join one because of those same kinds of emotional reasons. The same kind of emotional reasons that lead the overt tribalists to seek comfort in their family or in their ethnicity leads us, perhaps sometimes, to seek that kind of comfort in one of those two groups, even if we don't share their overt kind of ethnic motivations. And that's the kind that I want to try to warn you against today. So again, back to the three signs by which you can recognize how much tribalism there is in our system today. First of them, fortunately, Greg Salmieri has laid the groundwork of this point for me quite well in his first talk this morning. Remember those two lists of different policy positions that are associated with the so-called right and with the so-called left? I want to drill down into one of those examples, but think of all the different positions you saw on those lists and ask yourself, what do these positions have to do with each other? It looks like they're just accidentally related to each other, that there's no real ideological principle putting them together. And I'll give you one specific example of this. Let's talk about the so-called liberals in the United States today, the left-wing end of the political spectrum represented by the Democratic Party. One position that the Democrats are generally in favor of is various forms of economic regulation on business. The idea is that unfettered economic freedom is destabilizing. There need to be smart regulations in order to protect what they call the public interest. On the other hand, though, the Democrats are very much in favor of unfettered freedom for women who want to have an abortion. So what is it that joins these two positions together? It's certainly not any kind of principled commitment to the idea of individual freedom, because one of these positions seems to be against it and the other one seems to be in favor of it. And I should just mention, for the sake of clarity, Ayn Rand was in favor of the woman's right to an abortion and opposed to economic regulations like this because she thought they violated economic freedom, and she didn't think economic freedom and personal freedom were all that different philosophically. We could talk more about that later if you wanted to. But the Democrats' position is definitely not integrated by any kind of commitment to freedom. So what is it integrated by? What does unite them, if anything? Not any overt ideological principle, but there's still something. There's still basically historical forces that have put these two positions together. And if you think about it in terms of, if you think of abortion, for instance, not as an issue of personal freedom, but as a woman's issue, I think that helps explain why it gets slotted into this leftist political camp. The view is that women are a historically oppressed group. They've been oppressed by men, and all of the oppressed groups need to bind themselves together under the leftist political banner in order to protect themselves. But it's not any explicit ideological commitment that puts these groups together. It's rather it's sociological forces that have caused people to be frightened by these perceived oppressors, and hateful of these oppressors. So it really ends up being just a kind of alliance of convenience. And these alliances of convenience are notoriously temporary. What explains this? Why do these kinds of alliances form in our current political climate? And I think Ayn Rand had a very interesting explanation for this kind of fact. In her essay, A Nation's Unity, she wrote the following, and this picks up on some of the things that Dr. Brooke was talking about earlier today. She wrote, "In a mixed economy dominated by the philosophy of pragmatism, a political candidate does not dare proclaim clear-cut principles. He has to pay lip service to the notions of every pressure group and to the opposite of his own convictions, if any." Her idea here is that the very kind of economic regulations motivated by the idea of the public interest that, in this case, the left favors, end up pitting people against each other. They divide people into what she called economic pressure groups. And that's because she thought, as an individualist, there's no such thing as a literal public interest. There's no such thing as the public. All there is sacrificing the interests of one group of people to maybe a larger group of other people. And so people are incentivized to band together for self-protection so that they can get together, try to sell themselves as the public so that they will be the recipients of the sacrifice and not the reverse. But this means that they are now thinking of each other in terms of what group am I a member of, not what ideas do I hold to. And whether these alliances of convenience work and whether they end up being counted as the public interest in the end is something that is, again, very, very temporary. And that gets us to the second major sign of political tribalism that I wanted to talk about. And it's closely related. If a party's positions are accidentally related in the first place, then it shouldn't be a surprise that they're also going to change fairly arbitrarily. And this time I want to focus just on one example on the other side of the political spectrum. I want to say something about conservatives, so-called conservatives on the right, especially lately on the topic of immigration and free trade. That's a picture of George H.W. Bush the Elder in, I think, 1990, overseeing the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada. And for many years, the Republicans were the champions of international free trade and open immigration. If you go on YouTube, you can see these amazing debates in the presidential elections, I think in 1992, where all the Republican candidates are, actually, no, it was earlier than that even, in 84, between Reagan and Bush. And both of them are kind of outdoing each other to see who can say more things in favor of immigration. But you know, of course, that it didn't stay that way. And very recently, this guy has called for the opposite and has called to put greater restrictions on immigration and free trade. And I think it's very important that he's doing so, again, on these kind of tribalistic grounds that, and Yaron Brook talked about this, that the Chinese and the Mexicans, they're stealing our jobs. Who's the our there? Who's the we? Well, it's the we who just so happen to have been born in this country by accident. We didn't have anything to do with it. And often there's a further implication sometimes behind the wings that we are a certain ethnic group who deserves these jobs. And that, by the way, is why people in Wisconsin need something to root for, because the Packers are all they have. They don't have the jobs anymore. So And this is a very dramatic shift. The rapidity of the shift, I think, testifies to the fact that they probably didn't have that principled of a commitment to free trade and immigration under the heading of economic liberty in the first place. That whatever commitment they had to it was more of a product of historical accident. I think it's really important, for instance, that the modern conservative movement of the 20th century really began in the 50s and the 60s. There was an alliance between free marketeers and religious conservatives. What blended them together? Well, it was the opposition. They joined together in opposition to the threat of communism. They're atheists and communists. Well, what happens when the Soviet threat is eclipsed? You don't have them as an enemy anymore. You need to search for new enemies. And Chinese and Mexicans and others serve that purpose conveniently. So if it's not any kind of loyalty to an ideological principle that explains why the parties are shifting their positions in this way, what does? What do they have loyalty to? And here's a passage from another essay by Ayn Rand, which I strongly recommend as many of you can to read this, because it's one of the essays where she lays out most of her theoretical understanding of what tribalism is and where it comes from. And I can't elaborate on that here, but I will look at this passage where she says, "The basic commandment of all such groups, which takes precedence over any other rules, is loyalty to the group, not to ideas, but to people, not to the group's beliefs, which are minimal and chiefly ritualistic, but to the group's members and leaders." So why do the Republicans all of a sudden turn on a dime about immigration and free trade? Well, part of it is because of these historical accidents that I mentioned, but another big part of it is because the whims of the leaders change. The Republicans in this case are not loyal to the idea of free trade, but they're, at least a substantial number of them, enough to get him elected, are loyal to Trump. And maybe Trump notes that he needs a new enemy to motivate them. So these interest groups, they're led by the whims of leaders, not any kind of ideological concepts. So how do these leaders manipulate their voters into voting for them and into continuing to support them politically in other ways? This gets me to the third big sign of tribalism that I want to talk about, and that's the increasing emotionalistic rhetoric of today's political parties. I was originally going to use the example of the Kavanaugh hearings to illustrate this, but Greg covered this quite well, and I'll just endorse what he said about that. I think it was an extremely tribalistic controversy, and I could say more about that later if you wanted me to. But generally, you see incredible appeals to emotion made whenever there's some kind of national tragedy. People are very quick to judge, even before the evidence comes in about who did some school shooting or what the police officer involved in a police shooting was reacting to. But let me just focus on one big issue which relates to some things we've already talked about, which is the immigration controversy, which is really, from my view at least, come out of nowhere. It wasn't an issue for most people even 5 years ago, and yet it has now become extremely heated. If you look at the rhetoric on the left about this topic, and you see how they react, for instance, to the Trump administration's parent-child separation policy, the overwhelming amount of rhetoric is Republicans want to take children away from their parents, and that's awful. And it does sound pretty awful, right? It's designed to sound awful. It doesn't take fully into consideration the fact that, well, the alternative in this case is to put the children in jail with the parents who are arrested. That doesn't seem like it would be any more humane. But it's not just the left that has this problem. Lately, I think the right has been particularly vociferous in its emotionalism on the immigration issue. The right will accuse the left of wanting to have completely open borders without any evidence that that's what they want. And if you want to ask me about that, I'll comment later. It invents conspiracy theories about who's funding the caravan that's allegedly headed towards us, and what the caravan is going to do, and people are going to spill over our borders, and it's really secretly Israel and George Soros. And is it any wonder when crazy people listen to this and shoot up synagogues? That's the end point of this kind of emotionalism in this debate about immigration. Why is it that tribalism leads to such emotionalistic rhetoric? Well, some of this we should already understand, I hope, from what we've discussed today about how part of what's essential to tribalism is a focus not on ideological, intellectual values that bind people together, but accidental, biological, sometimes merely visible features. And those are the kinds of things that cue people's emotions. But more importantly than that is, I think, this. And here's one last quotation from Ayn Rand from her essay, Credibility and Polarization. And this, I think, really captures the essence of it. She says, "The country is splitting into dozens of blind, deaf, but screaming camps, each drawn together not by loyalty to an idea, but by the accident of race, age, sex, religious creed, or the frantic whim of a given moment, not by values held in common," and this is the really important point I want to flag, "but by a common hatred of some other group, not by choice, but by terror." How do these leaders manipulate people through emotions? Primarily, they do it by negative emotions, by fear and hatred. And I think this is one of the most tragic things about tribalism in politics, because with so much focus on how much you hate the other side, you lose track of what values you love, if you had any to begin with. With all this talk of making America great again, we forget, what is it that makes America great? Wasn't it something about individualism and freedom and the pursuit of happiness, not just hating on the Democrats and the Chinese and the Mexicans? So, with all that in mind, I want to wrap up, if that's enough to have in mind to wrap up. I want to wrap up with what I think are just some practical tips for avoiding the pull of these tribes who are using this emotionalistic rhetoric to try to pull you in, who are trying to get you to ignore the fact that they're changing their positions so rapidly, and that nothing actually binds their positions together intellectually. And you've maybe heard the leftist expression, check your privilege. Well, I have a counter-proposal. How about check your tribalism? And by this, I seriously mean we have tendencies to tribalism. There's a discussion about what does that mean. Yaron said it's a kind of default we engage in when we don't choose to think. I think that's a good way of putting it. Here are 4 areas of life where I think you can ask yourself a question. How do you deal with each of these kinds of issues? How you answer this question, I think, should tell you something about whether you've got some issues with tribalism. News consumption. Do you live in a kind of news bubble in your social media feeds where you get all of your news from people who are your friends, your relatives, most of whom, let's say, happen to have the same general political affiliation? And do you accept most of it uncritically? Or do you make an effort to try to read stories from multiple sources from across the political spectrum? And even then, do you try to actively process what both of them are saying and decide for yourself whether what they're saying is true, whether it integrates with the evidence that you yourself have and can make the best sense of? What is your attitude, and by the way, I should say, I have a talk I did at a recent conference on being objective about the news, and you can look that up on YouTube, and I give a lot more advice on that specific topic. What's your attitude about voting? Do you feel like you've got a duty to vote for one party or another all the time, and it would be wrong to sit it out? Or do you think it really depends on what the election is and who the parties are and whether there's one that's clearly better than the other and what the stakes are? Do you follow political controversies more generally because of sort of the entertainment value of it? You like to root for one side and see them win, kind of like sports. Or even worse, you get a kind of power kick from knowing that your team won. Or do you care about political controversies to the extent that they bear on your own life and values? And about those values, and I think I want to reaffirm what Dr. Gatte said on this, do you take them sort of piecemeal from the people who happen to be around you? Or do you try to see how they can be connected together in the form of philosophical principles so that they can be your values, not just the ones that you absorbed from your environment? Well, I hope it is obvious that I think the way of thinking on the left is the tribalist attitude, and on the right is the more individualist attitude. So look, takeaway points. Politics is not a game. It makes a difference who's in charge. And you don't have to choose a team. Sometimes you don't have to vote at all. At the very least, you have to vote strategically. But last of all, not choosing a team doesn't mean you don't decide for yourself what the right position is, even if it's a position that's not represented by any collection of positions in a single party. So even if you don't have to choose a team, what an individualist does is still to take a stand. Thank you. We got about 11 minutes for questions here. Over here?
Hi, Ben. So you mentioned that signs of parties being tribalistic, so they have accidentally related positions and their positions change arbitrarily.
Those are the first two, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So does the big tent libertarian movement also fall under this kind of political tribalism?
I believe it does, but for slightly different reasons than the ones that I talked about. And this is a long issue, a big issue that I would probably I should refer you to the conference that we did last year on the topic of what is it to be for liberty. And a number of speakers who are present here did substantial analysis of the libertarian movement. And one thing I'll say is that, I mean, you might look at the libertarian movement and say, no, there's a case where, I mean, they even call themselves this. The Libertarian Party calls themselves the party of principle, right? And there's a sense in which many of them are more intellectual than what you might see among standard political operatives on major parties. But at the same time, there's something phony about it, because what does it mean to be for liberty? That was the title of the conference last year. And they'll all affirm their commitment to that concept, but what they mean by it, first of all, differs dramatically from what Ayn Rand meant by it, but then even amongst themselves differs dramatically. And some of them are anarchists, some of them think there should be a government, some of them believe the United States should surrender its foreign policy to foreign powers, et cetera. Others don't. So there's more incoherence there than you might otherwise guess if you were only looking at the party propaganda. And there's a tremendous amount of infighting because of it, and constant splits from that party. But I really do want to recommend the previous conference, and it's all up on, a lot of it is on YouTube, if you go to YouTube right now.
Thank you.
So are you saying we shouldn't want to own the libs? Okay, real question. Can you parse out the differences between a tribe and a cult?
Ooh, that's a good question. I've not thought a lot about it. There's definitely some similarity, especially in the regard that there's a lot of loyalty to people rather than ideas. What we call cults are often, they're cults of personality. There's a charismatic leader. I haven't thought enough about whether the way people use the word cult refers to, is a valid concept that integrates a real phenomenon. Sometimes I want to say all a cult is a small new religious group that the big religious groups don't like. And if that's what it is, it's not a valid concept. But there is a phenomenon of people who are much too loyal to a charismatic leader and who get themselves into trouble and who sacrifice their minds and sometimes their lives because of that. I don't think that all tribalists are cultists, so that's certainly not the case. It might be that there's an overlap in attitude, but I shouldn't say more without knowing what exactly to think about the concept of cult.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you think that Trump and his vociferous emotionalism will have a lasting impact on American politics, and I hesitate to say this, but sort of American culture as a whole.
Will Trump's emotionalism have lasting effect on American politics? I worry that it does. I don't know how to answer that question with certainty because sometimes it seems like America temporarily loses its mind and then reforms somewhat. But I am sympathetic with the commentators who say that there are certain kinds of behavior that Trump's example has normalized. And you certainly see people coming out of the woodwork and saying things that you wouldn't have dreamt of their having said prior to his election. All I can say is we'll only know after his term ends, whenever that may be.
Thank you.
Going back to the example about immigration, can you talk a little bit more about the right accusing the left of wanting open borders?
Sorry, talk a little bit more about the what?
The right accusing the left of wanting open borders and what this means?
Yes, thanks. So this is a really good example, actually, of the importance of looking at a variety of sources, I think, when you're hearing some of these claims. As far as I can tell, the main evidence that's been mustered for the claim that Democrats want open borders and want to abolish all immigration laws is that there are Democratic politicians, including many who are running for office right now, who want to abolish ICE. But you have to look at their reasons for doing that, for wanting to do that. And the reasons that I've found, you see this example, for example, with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She wants to abolish ICE. Her reason for doing that is because it's a relatively new legal regime that replaced the Immigration and Naturalization Service after 9/11, which concentrated all the powers of the Immigration Authority in one independent office, separate from, it used to be, the INS used to be, I believe, a branch of the Department of Justice. And being part of the Department of Justice, it was subject to certain kinds of judicial oversight that ICE is no longer subject to. And so her point is, this is not the way to enforce immigration laws. And you might still disagree with her about that. She wants to abolish that agency. I've seen no evidence that she or any other Democrats want to open the borders. And yet that claim is endlessly recycled, uncritically accepted, and even though I disagree with a lot about what the Democrats want to do, that's not their view, as far as I can tell.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you for a great lecture. It was really great to hear. And my question goes like that. Do you think that American politics tribalism is not created, but rather enhanced by the American electoral system, which definitely encourages two-party system and no middle ground or other ideas that can viably run for politics? And if yes, well, what do you think the electoral reforms should be to just that?
Just let me make sure I understand your question. Are you asking if there's something about the nature of the American electoral system
Exactly.
which leads to the problems that we're...
No, not leads to the problem, but rather enhances them, because, well, first of all, the electoral system just creates a two-party politics very naturally. The question is whether this two-party politics system enhance and increases tribalism in a United States politics.
This is not really my area of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
I do have one thought on the issue. And that is, well, what's the alternative to the system we have? And in my mind, the main alternative would be something like the parliamentary system
Mm-hmm.
that you see in Europe and Canada and elsewhere.
And
And my guess would be that that system makes tribalism even worse, because it gives very small parties from across the spectrum much more power than they would otherwise have, because they can become kingmakers in cobbling together coalition governments. And you have a fragmentation of these different groups, and usually along ethnic lines. And I think it's probably not an accident that tribalism in Europe is much worse than it is in America for that reason.
you think it's worse?
I can't argue for that right now, but yeah, I think I do.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's thank Dr. Bayer one more time.